shortly about the integration, the definition of integration, and the different level of regional integration forms. So first, here you can see in this slide, you can see the definition of the integration. Integration means unifying components into a whole, and this word we use in the economics as well, and since the Second World War, the term has been used for countries combining into large economic regions. And we can see market integration on the national level, on the regional level, and on the global level as well. So integration means the integration of the different market of goods, services, and the labor market, and we can speak about the integration of the financial and capital markets as well. So the economic integration is initiated by governments, or can be initiated by governments, as well as the private sector, I mean the companies. And in case of the private sector, we can speak about the trade of the companies, international trade of the companies, and foreign direct investments of the companies, and we can also speak about that foreign employment of workers. That means people can go and take a job in another country. They can take a job abroad. And of course, this is the market-led integration, when the different actors, so companies or the natural persons, the workers, they integrate the markets of different countries. So, and we can see an increased flow of capital, labor, goods or services among countries. This is the integration of the different markets. This type of integration can be developed further by the different agreements which are signed by governments. So, and we can differentiate some levels of this economic integration, which integration forms which are initiated by the governments. Here you can see the economic integration, the definition of economic integration initiated by governments, the different levels. Here you can see. So first, we can speak about free trade areas, and that means governments, at least two countries, conclude a free trade agreement, and they create a free trade area. That means they abolish tariffs and other restrictions, trade restrictions, quantitative restrictions like quotas between the participating countries. So, the countries which participate in the free trade area, they abolish tariffs and quantitative restrictions among each other. And they create a free trade area. We can say they integrate their market of goods. And the next level, we can see the customs union. In the customs union, countries which participate in a customs union, they have already created a free trade area, plus they equalize their tariffs against third countries, against those countries which are not participants in the customs union. So they create a common commercial policy. This is the customs union, and the next level, we can see the common market. In case of common market, the countries abolish not only the trade restrictions, but also restrictions on factor movements. Factor movements means the flow of labor and the capital. So they also liberalize the flows of capital and labor among each others. So those countries which participate in the common market, they have already abolished the trade restrictions among each other, plus they abolish the restrictions on factor movements. That means they abolish restrictions on the flows of labor or capital. So, and the next level is the single market. Single market is a more developed form of the integration. It also includes the abolishment of physical, technical, and fiscal barriers. So the countries abolish the border controls among each other. They also abolish several technical barriers. They unify their standards, regulations. They also abolish fiscal barriers. That means usually means the harmonization of the taxes or tax system. The single market, the European Union became a single market at the beginning of the 1990s. So, and the next level, we can see the economic union. This is distinct from a common market with some degrees of harmonization of national economic policies. So they harmonize, the countries harmonize the national economic policies. And the next level is the total economic integration. That means countries which are participant in this integration form, they unify their monetary, fiscal, and other policies as well, and they create a supranational authority, whose decisions are binding for all member states. So nowadays, the most developed integration form is the European Union. It is an economic and monetary union. So the European Union is an economic and monetary union. Monetary union means they have a common monetary policy and a common currency, but not every member state of the European Union is part of this Eurozone. So, for example, in Hungary, we have here in Hungary we have a local currency. So euro is not our legal currency. So we have forint, but some other countries in the European Union, so they haven't joined the Eurozone yet, but maybe in the future. So, and what is the main reason behind these regional initiatives? This is very important to define the main reasons and the main motivations behind these regional initiatives, which are launched by governments. The main reason is for these initiatives is to increase the welfare and real income in the participating countries, and they can achieve higher welfare and higher level of real income through static effects. That means the market liberalization could bring more efficient allocation of resources among countries, and they can bring improvements in terms of trade. And the dynamic effects of the market liberalization, which can also bring higher real income or increase the level of real income in a country. So these effects are technological improvements and the expansion of the capital stock. So now I will continue with the three big regional integration forms in the world economy. First, I start with the European Union, and then I will speak about the USMCA or NAFTA, and later I will speak about the ASEAN. I have already held a lecture on the global value chains, and I think Professor Lukács also spoke about the global value chains. And here I have to emphasize that these big regional integration forms cover the main three block or regional hubs of global value chains. This is also very important to know. And now let's see the European Union first. This is the oldest integration form, and it has reached the level of economic and monetary union over decades. We can, I think, over 4 decades, because it became an economic and monetary union in the 90s, and the European Union was established in the 50s. So it has reached the level of economic and monetary union over decades, and it is a unique form of integration in terms of its development, its institution, and the depth of the integration. So this kind of integration form you cannot find in the world, so it's very unique. And now I will speak shortly about the stages of the development, and I will focus on the main milestones of the development. At first, so after the Second World War, so in 1947, the USA launched the so-called Marshall Plan to help to rebuild Western Europe. And we can say the USA supported the development of the European integration, and behind this support we can see some political and strategic reasons. And the European regionalism is based on the French-German reconciliation. And we can see that the creation of this integration is politically motivated. But after a certain time, we can see that economic motivation became more and more important as well. So they created the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951, the Euratom and the European Economic Community in 1958. And later, these three communities were called together as the European communities. So this is the predecessor of the European Union, the European communities. And the European economic integration had become a common market by the end of the 1960s. But here I would like to add that I think the real common market was realized only at the end of the 80s, especially if we can speak about if we speak about the free flow of capital and the labor. So, but yeah, we would say they achieved some part of the common market by the end of the 1960s. And the European Union was created by 6 countries: Italy, France, Germany, and the Benelux countries. So Luxembourg, Belgium, and the Netherlands. So originally we can see 6 countries, and later some countries joined the European communities. So this was a very ambitious integration from the beginning. And in 1973, Denmark, the UK, and Ireland joined the European Union, or yeah, it is better to say the European communities. And in the 1970s, the European integration started to progress, and the next, I think the next milestone was important milestone in the development was in 1986, when the single European market was adopted, and this gave an impetus to the European integration. As I mentioned, they created a single market. So at the beginning of the 1990s, the European Union became a single market. And the European Single Act put new fields under the community law and launched institutional reforms to deepen the integration further. And in 1993, a Maastricht Treaty founded the European Union. And the main aim of this treaty was to establish an economic and monetary union, and the common currency, the euro, was introduced in 2002. As I mentioned, in not every country. And here I listed some treaties, important treaties, which have deepened the integration further and developed the institutional system of the European Union. And I also would like to list other countries which joined the European Union. So in the 80s, we could see the Mediterranean expansion of the European Union. Greece joined the EU in 1981. Spain and Portugal joined in 1986. In the 90s, we could see that Austria, Finland, and Sweden joined the European Union. And in 2004, there was a very big expansion of the European Union, the eastern expansion of the European Union, because several Central European countries, including Hungary, joined the European Union. These are the post-communist countries, plus 2 island countries, Malta and Cyprus, joined the European Union in the same year. And a little bit later, in 2007, Romania and Bulgaria joined the European Union, and in 2013, Croatia. And last year, we could see the Brexit. UK left. The UK left the European Union, and there is a very big issue about the Brexit, how the UK will leave the European Union. But I think here I would like to emphasize one thing, that the UK finally concluded a free trade agreement with the European Union, with the remaining of the remaining member countries. So the UK concluded a free trade agreement with the European Union. That means there is a free flow of goods between the UK and the European Union, but the customs procedures have returned. So that means goods which are traded between the UK and the European Union, they go through customs procedures, but the importers don't have to pay tariffs. And finally, I would like to emphasize 3 things in relation to the big expansion, eastern expansion of the European Union. This was a very important event for these countries, these post-communist countries, mostly post-communist countries, or socialist countries. It is also good if you say in this way. So after the end of the Cold War and after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Central European countries, so this region where we live and where you can find Hungary, so these countries in this region, they started to get closer to the European Union, and they applied for accession to the European Union and also to the NATO, which is a military alliance, and they wanted to stabilize their new domestic democratic system. So because after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we could see democratization movements in these countries, in this region, and they wanted to stabilize their domestic democratic systems, and they also wanted to expand and strengthen their safety. That is why they joined the Euro-Atlantic institution. This means the European Union and the NATO. And they also wanted to modernize their economies, and they wanted to catch up with the developed countries' western part of the European Union. So in the countries in this region, they are not developing countries, but their income level is much lower, which you can see in the western part of the European Union. And I think maybe I spoke about this, the production sharing in the manufacturing sector among Western European countries and the Central European countries. For those countries which are older participants in the European Union, they were very. They have also benefited a lot from the expansion of the European Union, because for them and for their companies, the expansion of the European Union brought a bigger market, and their companies created several affiliates or subsidiaries in Central Europe, which have the countries in this region have lower labor costs, and this was very good for the Western companies. This was the economic interest for them behind the expansion of the European Union, and they created, we can say, they expanded the global value chains or regional value chains towards eastern part of Europe, and beside the economic interest, we can also emphasize the security interests. So the European countries supported the accession of the CE countries to the EU because they wanted to strengthen their security, and they also supported the accession of these countries to the NATO Western military alliance. And this was the European Union. I think we can speak more about the European Union, but I think in this class here I only would like to highlight the milestones of the development of this integration form and the main economic benefits for these countries. So for the exam, you have to know only these things, and of course the member states of the European Union and the different level of the economic integration. And so I only highlighted the main important thing in the development of this integration form. And now I will continue with the North American Free Trade Agreement. This is NAFTA, and here you can see the member states, Canada, the United States, and Mexico. Sorry. So the USA had not promoted regionalism by the 1980s. That means they didn't conclude any free trade agreements. So I think they concluded their first free trade agreements with Israel in the 1980s. But before that, they preferred the market liberalization, the trade liberalization through the WTO, the World Trade Organization, but it is better to say the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. So the USA supported the multilateral trade liberalization before the 1980s, and they didn't support the creation of free trade agreements. This was true until the 1980s. And then in 1988, the USA concluded a free trade agreement with Canada, while negotiation on an FTA with Mexico was under progress. And NAFTA, so this agreement was concluded and came into effect in 1994. So among these three countries, and at that time, it was a very unique free trade agreement because a developing country concluded an FTA with the world's most advanced countries, so Canada and the United States. And here you can see the motivations for the conclusion of NAFTA. I listed the main motivations of Mexico, the United States, and Canada. So, as I mentioned, Mexico was a developing country and is still a developing country, but they focus on export-oriented industrialization. So this is its development strategy. They would like to develop their manufacturing sector and create an export-oriented manufacturing sector. And for that, and they would like to to realize this strategy, they needed foreign direct investments, and they for them, so for Mexico, it was very important to conclude this free trade agreement because it wanted to attract more foreign direct investments. They wanted to more foreign capital, which they can use in the development. They needed, of course, for the development of the manufacturing sector. And of course, as a developing country, they wanted to import advanced technology. And there was a crisis in the 90s in Mexico, so they also wanted to stabilize their economy. And this was another motivation behind the conclusion of this agreement. And they also, Mexico wanted to recover its international credibility after its debt crisis. And it wanted to tighten its economic relations with the USA. Of course, before the NAFTA, we could see that the American companies started to invest in Mexico because they were looking for low-cost production base, and many companies established factories in Mexico, and the final goods exported, they are export to the United States. So the final goods are transferred back to the United States. And that is why they needed to conclude the free trade agreements, because we could see an increase of trade between these two countries, Mexico and the United States, and they wanted to create a trade which is free from tariffs. And there are other motivations behind the NAFTA. In case of Mexico, this is I think it is a political motivation. We can also mention political motivations for Mexico. They wanted to become a diplomatic mediator between North and Latin America. The United States, what are the motivations of the United States? Of course, they wanted to decrease the Canadian tariffs. That means the tariffs which are on their products, which they have to pay those companies which import goods from the United States. And they also the United States wanted to support the participation of US companies in Canadian state investments. We can say the public tenders, and they wanted to get access to Canadian energy resources, and not only to the Canadian energy resources, but also to the Mexican oil resources. And through the agreements, they also wanted to stabilize the southern border, because there is I think in the 90s, but nowadays is still true, there is a very big immigration flow to to the United States from the southern part of America, not only from Mexico, but other South American or other Latin American countries. I already mentioned in case of Mexico that many US companies started to expand their production networks to Mexico, because Mexico is a developing country and they have a lower so in Mexico we can see a lower labor cost or cheaper labor, and they're also looking for market opportunities in Mexico. They wanted to sell more US products in Mexico. And of course, with the NAFTA, the United States wanted to strengthen its role in the world economy and world politics. In case of the EU, we could see that the single market was created in the 1990s and later the monetary union. And this can be a step or an answer to this integration or strengthening integration in the EU. This could be an answer from the United States. They also wanted to create an integration, stronger integration with the neighboring countries, but we will see that NAFTA is only a free trade agreement and remained in this level. And what are the motivations for Canada? Canada is a smaller economy if you compare to the United States, but also it's a developed country, a high-income country. It wanted to deepen economic relation with its main trading partner, the USA. They also wanted to get trade preferences, so create tariff-free trade with its biggest partner. And for them, the creation of the agreement also meant an expanding market for Canadian products. And as I mentioned, this agreement is only a free trade agreement, and the three member countries limited the development of this agreement. So they didn't want to create an integration form similar to the EU. And in case of NAFTA, we can only find a secretariat. This is the only institution which support the operation of NAFTA. And NAFTA doesn't have a central political, social, and economic organization, which we could see in case of the European Union. It doesn't have any supranational organizations. It only has a secretariat. What are the main elements of the NAFTA? This is a free trade agreement. That means it is mainly about the liberalization of trade in goods. In case of 50% of tariff lines, the tariffs were immediately abolished. In 1994, when the NAFTA came into effect. And in case of other products, we could see a schedule for the tariff abolishment. So it's longer, so over 5 or 10 or 15 years, especially in case of some sensitive products. For example, Mexico had very high tariffs in some, in case of some agricultural products, and they wanted to protect their market a little bit longer. And we can speak about not only, we can speak also about the abolishment of technical barriers. So we could see the unification of customs procedures and customs documents among countries. And they also liberalized partly the public procurements. And we could see liberalization of investments and services, for example, telecommunication sector, financial services sector. In the NAFTA agreement, we can also find measurements for protection, for the protection of intellectual property right, and regulation of the dispute settlement, which so these measurements help settle legal problems among countries. So that if there are some problems in the trade, they can settle. They also so we can find some regulations regarding dispute settlement in this agreement, and of course we could see harmonization on environmental and employment regulations or labor regulations among the countries, the participating countries. And what are the results of the NAFTA? We can see NAFTA fulfilled its economic goals, so it increased the competition in the domestic market, and we could see that the trade doubled among member countries, and we could see an increase of free trade foreign direct investments among member countries. And the North American economy is much more integrated and efficient than would be without NAFTA. So it became more integrated. So these three countries, the economies of these three member countries have become more integrated, and we can say have been functioning more efficiently. But unfortunately, in case of every free trade agreements, we can speak about negative effects of the free trade agreements beside the positive effects. And in case of USA, the big US companies, we can say they were the winners of NAFTA, and of course, small and medium enterprises could benefit to a certain extent, and they also could fulfill, the USA could fulfill its increased energy demand. But the assessment effects on the U.S. employment is controversial. That means so the NAFTA effects on the U.S. employment is controversial because many American workers, especially in the middle class, and I speak about the blue-collar workers, manufacturing workers, they feel that they are the losers in this agreement, and many of them lost their jobs because U.S. companies relocated their productions to Mexico. And in case of Mexico, we can see that for Mexico it was very important to get financial resources after the debt crisis. So the Mexican companies get loans from U.S. banks, and this was a positive thing for Mexico. And of course, they could develop their manufacturing sector, its manufacturing sector. They created the so-called maquiladora system. This is a Spanish word that means usually foreign companies which are settled or located in Mexico. They import a lot of inputs, and they create final goods, and they export back to the USA or to Canada. And so the NAFTA covers another big, so it is a big hub of, covers a big hub of value chains in the automotive, electronics, and apparel industry. And Mexico could attract foreign direct investments, not only from the USA, but other parts of the world, from Japanese companies and European companies, and many companies established affiliates in this country, and they export their goods to the United States. So Mexico, due to the NAFTA, or we can see partly due to the NAFTA, it became an important manufacturing exporter, and they could increase it. So Mexico could increase its trade, and they attracted a lot of foreign direct investments from NAFTA partners, so Canada and the USA. But I have already mentioned that not only from the NAFTA partners, but also from Japanese companies or Western European companies as well. Big domestic companies, I mean Mexican companies, could improve their productivity due to the import of foreign technology. And the big losers in Mexico were the farmers. They were not competitive enough if you compare to them the American farmers, so they suffered from the tariff abolishment a lot, and I think the USA couldn't manage to decrease the emigration to the USA, so emigration from Mexico to the USA. And what about Canada? Canada could increase the bilateral FDI flows with the USA, and many Canadian companies settled in Mexico. They created export-oriented efficiency seeking investments. They made export-oriented efficiency seeking investments in Mexico. So that means what they produce in Mexico, they finally export from these goods from Mexico. They also benefited from the lower labor costs of Mexico. The USA wanted to expand. So in the past, they wanted to expand the NAFTA to the whole American continent, except Cuba. So there was a plan for a free trade area of Americas. This was initiated by the American government in 1994, and the negotiations were between 1998 and 2005. But there were no results, so they were closed without any results. And some years ago, so in 1917, when Trump became the president of the USA, he started to renegotiate the NAFTA, and it managed. This was a very short time. In a very short time, he realized the renegotiation of NAFTA, and we can speak about a new agreement, renewal of NAFTA. This agreement is the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA. This is the abbreviation for this agreement. And this was signed and came into effect in 2018. And I think the main motivation was behind this, the renewal of NAFTA, was that Trump wanted to decrease the relocation of manufacturing productions from the USA to Mexico. That is why he could change certain rules, the rules of origin. And they also put new elements into this agreement, new regulations for digital trade and intellectual property rights, and he also renewed the regulations which are related to the labor and to employment and the environmental issues. So we can speak about a new agreement, which can be, I think, this is an agreement they can use for, this agreement will be reviewed every 6 years according to the new rules. So, and this agreement was, so it was signed in 2018, but it was only came into effect 2020. Okay, these things you have to know about NAFTA. First, you have to know the participating countries, and you have to know the main motivations behind the creation of these free trade agreements. You have to know the contents, the main elements of this agreement, and the benefits, You also have to know the benefits of this agreement or the negative effects as well. And you only have to know that this agreement was renewed some years ago, and this renewal of this agreement was initiated by Donald Trump, and now NAFTA is called as United States, Mexico, Canada agreement. And our third topic for today is the ASEAN and RCEP, which is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. First, I have to highlight that the most important thing related to ASEAN, these things, I think, why ASEAN can be differentiated from the EU or NAFTA. So because of its historical, political, and economic development, East Asia has not established an integration form similar to the EU. And it is true that will not step on this development path in the future. So we can surely state that East Asia, the integration in East Asia will not develop in this way, which we could see in case of the European Union. And if you compare the development of the regional integration of East Asia or Southeast Asia to the EU and NAFTA, we can see that regional integration initiated by governments have appeared, these forms, the regional integration forms initiated by governments have appeared late in East Asia if you compare to the EU or NAFTA. In case of East Asia, we could see rather market-led integration. But of course, this type of integration was supported unilateral liberalization of different countries, or the liberalization, multilateral liberalization under the GATT or WTO. So I will speak about the ASEAN, first about ASEAN, and then a little bit later about the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which originally covered ASEAN plus 6 countries. Okay, first let's see the ASEAN. This is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Here you can see the member countries, the 10 member countries: Myanmar, Laos, Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, Malaysia, Singapore, the Philippines, Brunei, and Indonesia. And we can speak about the ASEAN, the so-called ASEAN community. And the ASEAN community have 3 pillars: ASEAN Economic Community, Political Security Community, and Social Cultural Community. And in this class, I will focus only on the economic community and economic integration of this region. How ASEAN Economic Community started to evolve. So This association was created by 5 countries, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines in the 1967. And these are the non-communist countries from these regions. And similar to the European Union, this integration, the creation of this integration, or behind the creation of this integration, we can find political motivation. So these countries were colonies, European colonies, before the Second World War, and they became independent after the Second World War, and they wanted to stabilize the region, harmonize, we can say, the political relations, and fights against communism, the spread of communism. And this is why they created the so-called Association of Southeast Asian Nations. So it was politically motivated. So the creation of the ASEAN was politically motivated. And the other member countries, so other countries joined a little bit later. So Brunei in 1984, when it became independent from the United Kingdom. And the other countries, like Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar, and Cambodia, only joined in the 90s after the collapse of the Soviet Union and after the end of the Cold War. And ASEAN was established with the Bangkok Declaration in 1967, but this agreement contained only few economic commitments. So I think the political cooperation was much more important at that time, and in the field of regional, economic cooperations, member countries took their first measures in the second half of the 1990s. So these countries, most of these countries were very poor countries, colonies, former colonies. They focus on. They specialized on, so their economies were specialized on raw materials, industrial or agricultural commodities, the production of these commodities, industrial or agricultural commodities, and the export of these goods. So they were specialized on these things during the colonial times. And they were poor countries. And the Europe and the United Nations recommended different regional cooperation programs for these countries. And these programs we can find in the so-called Council report, which was prepared in 1974. Here you can see the different programs which were initiated by the UN and recommended by the UN for the ASEAN countries. I will not go into the details. You only have to know the names of these programs. ASEAN Industrial Projects, ASEAN Preferential Trade Agreement, ASEAN Industrial Complementation, And a little bit later, there was another initiative, but this was not recommended by the UN. This was the ASEAN Industrial Joint Venture. So, in sum, we can say intra-regional cooperation between 1976 and 1987 was based on these initiatives, which I have just mentioned. And they aimed at realizing a common import substitution industrialization strategy in heavy and chemical industry. That means ASEAN countries wanted to develop their heavy and chemical industry together, and they wanted to trade with these goods among each other. But in sum, we can say, and finally we can conclude that early initiatives could not evolve according to the plans and did not create any significant economic benefits in regional relations. So we can say the early regional economic cooperation was not successful in the ASEAN countries. And a little bit later, in the mid 1980s, we could see a change in the economic development strategy of each ASEAN country, and they have switched from import substitution to export-oriented industrialization, in which foreign direct investments have had a significant role. So these countries, as I mentioned, most of these countries, so they were colonies, most of them were colonies. And their economies were specialized on the production of raw materials, industrial or agricultural raw materials, commodities, which they export. And they wanted to create and develop the manufacturing sector, but of course they needed foreign capital. Of course, they could rely on their own savings, domestic savings, and domestic capital accumulation, but they have to attract foreign capital to develop their manufacturing sector. And we could see a switch in their economic development strategy from import substitution to export-oriented industrialization. In case of Singapore, this switch happened much more earlier in the 1960s. So we can see in the second half of the 1980s, Thailand, Indonesia, and Malaysia, these countries started to launch liberalization, deregulation, and reforms, market reforms. And parallel with this, foreign direct investments began to expand in the region. I mentioned in the class of global value chains that from developing countries or out of the developing countries, I think the Southeast Asian countries they were the first countries which joined the global value chains. And many companies from more developed East Asian countries started to expand in this region in Southeast Asia. We can see that production networks of East Asian, Europe, and of course, European and American transnational corporations started to integrate Southeast Asian economies. So we can see the inflow of capital from Japan, Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea, and of course from the United States and the European Union, and transnational corporations, or Western transnational corporations of East Asian transnational corporation started to build production networks in Southeast Asia, in electronics, automotive industry, and the textile apparel industry. And so every country, I mean, Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, and of course Singapore. So they rely very much on foreign capital, and they focus on their own economic development. But we could see an intensification of the competition among developing countries for foreign direct investments in the 90s. So ASEAN countries had to come together and create regional cooperations, because they face a very strong competition from China and India. So there are these two big economies with a neighboring, which are in the neighborhood of this region, and they are very big economies, and they are also they also chose similar development strategy, and they wanted to rely more on foreign direct investments, and for them this were very important from the perspective of its economic development. And that is why the ASEAN countries joined together, and since the 1980s, the main aims of the regional integration agreements of ASEAN countries is to abolish barriers among ASEAN economies, expand the market, to make the region more attractive for foreign investors, and facilitate more efficient operation of production networks in the region. So for them, the ASEAN countries, is very important to abolish barriers among each others, especially in case of the market of goods. So they liberalize the trade among each other. And why this is important for them? Because in this way, they can create a big regional market which can compete with China and India for foreign direct investments. And this big regional market, Southeast Asian market, can be more attractive for foreign investors. And of course, this is good for the production networks, which cover several countries, and for the companies which created production networks in this region, for them it's very important the tariff-free trade, because they import a lot of parts and components, and that is why for them it's very important a tariff-free trade on the regional level. And here I listed the most important regional agreements which are signed by the which were signed by the ASEAN countries, and these agreements are related to the liberalization of investments, the liberalization of market of goods or services, or we can also speak about, but we can also speak about the liberalization of the labor market, but this is very limited. So the ASEAN Investment Guarantee Agreement and the Framework Agreement of ASEAN Investment Area and the ASEAN Comprehensive Investment Agreement. So these agreements are related to the liberalization of investments among each other. So they liberalize the intra-regional investments among ASEAN countries, but they also this agreement, the Comprehensive Investment Agreement, it contains the liberalization of investments for extra-regional partners. So ASEAN countries try to open their market for foreign investors more and more. And the ASEAN Comprehensive Investment Agreement combines these two previous agreements, the Framework Agreement of ASEAN Investment Area and the ASEAN Investment Guarantee Agreement. And so there are several other agreements which are related to the trade liberalization, like brand complementations. So this includes these agreements, which I will list. They include tariff reduction, different agreements which are related to tariff reductions, like brand complementation, ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, ASEAN Industrial Cooperation Scheme, and finally, ASEAN Trade in Goods Agreement. So, as I mentioned, so ASEAN is a free trade. They wanted to create a free trade. For them, it's very important to abolish the tariffs and other trade restrictions. And many of these agreements, so we can find other initiators behind these agreements. So Japanese companies, they are the main investors in Southeast Asia. Maybe not so dominant nowadays, but still important. That's still one of the biggest investors. But at the time, I mean the 80s and the 90s, we could see the dominance of the Japanese companies and their investments in Southeast Asia. And these companies created production networks, and they wanted to get tariff-free trade opportunities. So they wanted to diminish the tariffs among ASEAN countries, because for them it was very important, because they created production networks in this region. So brand complementation, and behind this agreement and behind the AFTA agreement, the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, the ASEAN Industrial Cooperation Scheme, we can see that this we can find behind these agreements as an initiator. We can find Japanese companies as initiators. So for them, it was very important to create free trade among ASEAN countries. And nowadays, the ASEAN Trade in Goods Agreement includes the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, and this is we can say a more developed agreement or developed form of the free trade agreement, previous free trade agreement. They also concluded an agreement on services. They also tried to liberalize the services. They wanted to create free flow of services among each other. And finally, they also conclude an agreement on the movement of natural persons. But this not means that without visa or permission you can move and take a job in another ASEAN country. But this agreement helps the easier move of people among ASEAN countries. And so these agreements, these agreements, we can say, these are the base for the ASEAN economic community. And ASEAN countries wanted to create this community. The plan of the creation of this community was first formulated in 1997. And in 2003, the ASEAN heads of government and state decided on the establishment of ASEAN community by 2020. But a little bit later in 2007, they changed the target date to 2015. So they created this community by 2015. But we have to say that this is not an end of the development of this integration. This integration, we can see further development of this integration. So 2015 only an intermediate stage. This date rather marks an intermediate stage of development for ASEAN. And according to the definition of the ASEAN, or the definition for ASEAN economic community, which is used by ASEAN, is the following. So they say that the economic community is a single market and a production base where goods, services, investments, and skilled labor flow freely and capital flows more freely. But if we look at the content of the agreements which I have just listed, we can say that ASEAN regional agreements do not lead to a single market. So the ASEAN economic community can be considered as an expanded version of free trade area. So it is a free trade area, which also include some measurements which liberalize the investments and the flow of services as well, but still we can say that it is a free trade area. It's not a single market. Fiscal barriers and customs control have remained among member countries. We cannot speak about the abolishment of fiscal and technical barriers, and ASEAN countries have not created a common market, have not created a common market, neither a customs union. So, as I mentioned, ASEAN countries wanted to create through the regional agreements, wanted to create a highly liberalized regional market and a single production base, which attract new foreign investments and help regional production networks to operate efficiently. So that is why they try to integrate the markets, the different the markets of different countries, because they would like to become more attractive for the foreign capital. They wanted to create a big regional market which can be competitive with China and India, and which is attractive for the foreign direct investors, and where the regional production networks, which were created by transnational corporations, can operate efficiently. And the regional production networks in Southeast Asia are not limited to the region. It covered the whole, so they cover whole East Asia. So not only Southeast Asia, but the whole region, East Asia. So Japan, China, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, so other countries in this region. And ASEAN has concluded several free trade agreements with these countries, so China, Japan, South Korea, India, Australia, New Zealand since 2000. So they concluded FTA +1 agreements. And finally, in 2013, negotiation on the so-called Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership were launched by ASEAN plus China, Japan, South Korea, India, Australia, and New Zealand. So ASEAN +6, we can call this agreement ASEAN +6. And this can be considered as the geographical expansion of the regional market and single production base of the ASEAN economic community. And this agreement was signed in November 2020. So last year, this agreement was signed, but India opted out of RCEP negotiation in 2019. So we can say that RCEP is only ASEAN +5 agreement. And I will finish here, but I will shortly summarize what you have to know from these slides. So you have to know, of course, the participant countries, the 10 countries, when it was created, so the year of the establishment, which countries are the original countries of the ASEAN, when the other countries joined the ASEAN. You have to know that there is the economic cooperation, regional cooperations among these countries was about the creation of import substitution industrialization strategy in heavy and chemical industry. This was true in the 70s and the 80s, and later we can see a switch in the economic development strategy to an export-oriented industrialization strategy. In this strategy, foreign direct investments play an important role. And you have to know that what kind of agreements, regional agreements, ASEAN countries have signed, and these agreements, what is the main aim of these agreements, liberalization of trade, services, and investments, and what is the main motivation behind these agreements, yet to create a big regional market which is attractive for foreign direct investments and where the production networks can operate efficiently. And you have to know that ASEAN is only an expanded version. ASEAN Economic Community is an expanded version of free trade area, so they didn't create a common market or customs union or single market. So this is only an expanded version of free trade area. And you have to know that the expanded version of the economic community, this regional market and production base, is the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which was signed last year, and you have to know the member states of the RCEP also. So, do you have any questions regarding this topic?
No.
Okay. If not, thank you very much for your attention, and I will upload these PPT slides to the Moodle. Okay, and thank you very much, and have a nice day.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Have a nice day. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.